Antonelli didn't just win in Miami, he survived a race where he lost the lead in the first corner, fought through 4 top drivers, drove with a damaged car, pushed track limits under FIA review, and still crossed the line first, and now, that exact performance is being quietly investigated. Because here's what doesn't add up. A driver with gearbox issues, in light rain, under pressure from one of the fastest cars on the grid, doesn't usually pull away and win clean. But he did. And the FIA noticed. What really happened in those final laps is something most people completely missed. The race didn't begin with dominance, it began with a mistake that should have cost him everything. Antonelli launched from pole, the perfect position, clean side of the grid, nothing in front of him but open track. For a moment, it looked routine. Predictable. Then, in less than a second, it all broke down. The car hesitated. The power didn't arrive when it should. And just like that, he was swallowed. Verstappen surged past. Norris followed. The calm disappeared and turned into pure chaos before they even reached the first corner. And here's the detail that changes how you see the entire race. This wasn't driver error. It was mechanical. The Mercedes had a known issue at launch, a delay between throttle and full power, something so small you'd never notice it on TV, but big enough to lose multiple positions instantly. Imagine trying to sprint, but your legs respond half a second late. That's all it takes. And in Formula 1, that delay doesn't just cost positions. It puts you in danger. It throws you into traffic, into unpredictable battles, into a race you can't control anymore. Now here's where everything could have gone wrong. Turn 1 in Miami is tight. There's no space, no forgiveness. Cars dive in from different angles, braking zones overlap, and one small misjudgment can end your race on the spot. Gasly didn't make it through. He crashed out almost immediately, triggering early chaos and reshuffling the order. Antonelli could have been next. But he wasn't. Instead of backing off, instead of playing safe, he stayed aggressive. Calm, but aggressive. And that combination is rare. Because most drivers, especially under pressure, choose one or the other. He chose both. And this is where the race quietly started to turn. While everyone focused on who was leading, Antonelli started building something invisible. Momentum. He passed Leclerc first. Not clean, not easy, but controlled. Then he hunted Piastri. Then he positioned himself within striking distance of Verstappen and Norris. Each move looked like a recovery. But it wasn't just recovery. It was set up. Because behind the scenes, Mercedes wasn't reacting to the race. They were shaping it. And almost nobody noticed it at the time. But just as Antonelli was rebuilding his race, something else was quietly unfolding at the front. Verstappen had taken control early. Clean air, clear vision, no traffic. Behind him, Norris and Piastri were locking down a strong position for McLaren. On paper, this was their race to lose. And that's what made the next phase so important. Because even though Antonelli was climbing back, he wasn't the fastest car on track. That's a key detail. McLaren had the pace. Consistent, stable, especially over long runs. Norris wasn't just defending, he was managing, waiting, watching everything behind him. So now the situation becomes very clear. Antonelli needed something more than overtakes. He needed a shift. And this is where strategy enters the story, but not in an obvious way. Not a gamble. Not a risky call. Something much more precise. Lap after lap, Mercedes kept him out just long enough. Not too early, not too late. They were watching tire wear, gaps, traffic, and most importantly, timing. Because in Formula 1, timing isn't about seconds. It's about windows. Miss it, and you're stuck behind slower cars. Hit it perfectly, and you jump positions without even overtaking on track. And here's where things start to feel almost calculated. Lap 27. Antonelli pits. No hesitation. No confusion. The stop is clean, fast, exact. He comes back out on fresh tires, and suddenly, everything changes. Grip returns instantly. The car feels alive again. Every corner becomes sharper, every exit more powerful. Meanwhile, Norris stays out. Just one more lap. That decision, that single lap, is where the race was decided. Because while Norris was still running on worn tires, Antonelli was already pushing at full speed. Closing the gap. Erasing the deficit. And when Norris finally pitted, the damage was done. He came out behind. No wheel-to-wheel fight. No dramatic overtake. Just pure execution. And this is why some people in the paddock started paying closer attention. Because this wasn't luck. It was precision under pressure. But here's the part that makes it even more interesting. From that moment on, Antonelli wasn't just leading the race. He was managing something far more fragile than a gap to Norris. He was managing a car that was starting to fall apart. And this is where the story stops being about strategy and starts becoming something much harder to explain. Because once Antonelli took the lead, the expectation was simple. Control the pace. Manage the gap. Bring the car home. But that's not what happened. Instead, the radio lit up. Problems. Not small ones either. Gearbox instability. Throttle response issues. The kind of messages that usually come right before a driver is told to retire the car. Now think about the timing. You've just taken the lead through a perfect strategy call. The fastest car behind you is within reach. The pressure is building. And suddenly, your car starts misbehaving. That's not just difficult. That's where races fall apart. And yet, his pace didn't collapse. That's the part nobody expected. Because when a driver has gearbox issues, every shift becomes a risk. Too aggressive, and you lose the system. Too cautious, and you lose time. It's like walking on a tightrope while someone is slowly cutting the rope, and still choosing to run. But Antonelli didn't panic. He adapted again. Short shifting. Managing exits. Adjusting his driving style corner by corner. Subtle changes that don't show on broadcast, but define whether you finish or fail. And right behind him, Norris was watching everything. Waiting. Staying close enough to strike, but never quite getting the opportunity. And that detail is more important than it looks. Because Norris wasn't making mistakes. The McLaren was fast. Consistent. Strong over long runs. If there was even a small opening, he would have taken it. But it never came. And just when it felt like the situation couldn't get more unstable, the track changed. Light rain began to fall. Not enough to trigger chaos instantly, but enough to make every braking zone uncertain, every corner unpredictable. Now imagine this combination. A leading driver. A car with technical issues. A rival within seconds. And a track losing grip, one corner at a time. This is where control usually disappears. But somehow, he held it together. Lap after lap. No spins. No major mistakes. No visible drop in performance that Norris could exploit. And this is exactly the moment when attention shifted again. Because it wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about how he was surviving. Observers began noticing something subtle. Corner exits, getting wider. Margins, getting tighter. Lines, pushing right to the edge of what's allowed. And in normal conditions, that might go unnoticed. But under pressure, in changing grip, with everything on the line, those details start to matter. A lot. Because in Formula 1, the difference between control and advantage is often just a few centimeters. And that's exactly where the next layer of this story begins. And this is the point where the race stopped being judged by lap times, and started being judged by millimeters. Because in those final laps, with the pressure at its peak, every corner exit Antonelli made carried a hidden question. Was he still within the limits, or just beyond them? From the outside, it looked clean. Smooth steering. No obvious mistakes. No dramatic corrections. But Formula 1 doesn't measure what looks clean. It measures precision. And precision, at that level, is brutal. Track limits are simple in theory. Stay within the white lines. Keep at least part of the car inside. But in reality, it's not that simple. Especially when the track is changing. Especially when tires are worn. And especially when light rain starts to blur the line between grip and slip. Because suddenly, the car doesn't behave the same way twice. You take one corner perfectly, and the next one pushes you half a meter wider. Not because you want to gain an advantage, but because the car demands it. Now add pressure. Norris, right behind, waiting for the smallest error. A car that isn't shifting properly. A throttle that doesn't respond the same way every lap. And a surface that's becoming unpredictable. This is where instincts take over. And instincts don't always respect painted lines. So the stewards started watching. Not immediately. Not dramatically. Quietly. Lap after lap, especially toward the end, certain corners were reviewed more closely. The exits. The areas where drivers tend to stretch the limits when they're defending a position. And here's what makes this so important. Antonelli had already been penalized for track limits earlier in the weekend, during the sprint. So this wasn't a new concern. It was a known pattern. Which means when it happened again, under race-winning conditions, it carried more weight. But still, no penalty came. And that's where the tension really begins. Because passing an investigation doesn't mean nothing happened. It means nothing crossed the threshold. And that threshold is incredibly fine. We're talking about centimeters. Fractions of a second. Moments that are almost impossible to judge without slow motion and data. Now think about what that creates. A driver pushing to the absolute edge. A car that's unstable. Conditions that are changing. And officials reviewing everything in real time. This isn't just racing anymore. This is control under surveillance. And when a win is built in that environment, people don't just celebrate it. They analyze it. Because the question isn't whether Antonelli broke the rules. The question is how close he got, while still winning. And that's a very different kind of dominance. One that doesn't rely on being faster, but on understanding exactly where the limit is, and living right on top of it. And this is where everything connects, not just the driving, not just the strategy, but the bigger picture that started forming the moment the checkered flag dropped. Because the reaction across the paddock wasn't simple. It wasn't just admiration. It was hesitation. On one side, you had Mercedes celebrating what they called their most complete victory of the season. A race won not just with speed, but with execution, pressure management, and perfect timing. On the other side, you had rivals trying to understand how it all fit together. McLaren, for example, had the pace. That much was clear. Norris finished just over 3 seconds behind, the closest gap to a winner all season. But here's the detail that stayed with people. He was close, but never close enough. Lap after lap, even with a strong car, even with a clean race, Norris couldn't break into attacking distance. The gap stayed just out of reach, like there was an invisible barrier he couldn't cross. And that raises a difficult question. If Antonelli had technical issues, if the conditions were getting worse, if the pressure was constant, why didn't the gap collapse? That's the kind of question teams don't ignore. Then there's Ferrari. They arrived with the biggest upgrade package of the weekend. More parts, more changes, more expectations than anyone else. And they finished 6th and 7th. Not just behind Antonelli. Behind almost everyone who mattered. Which creates another layer of contrast. One team brings everything, and falls back. Another brings very little, and still wins. That difference doesn't just stand out. It demands explanation. And then there's Red Bull. Verstappen led the race early. He had the position, the track, the opportunity. And still, he ended up 5th. No fight for the win. No late comeback. Just fading out of contention. So now step back and look at the full picture. Every major rival had a piece of the race. McLaren had pace. Ferrari had upgrades. Red Bull had track position early on. And yet, none of it was enough. Antonelli beat all of them. Under pressure. With issues. On a track that was changing. While being reviewed. That's not a normal win. That's a statement. But statements in Formula One come with consequences. Because the moment one driver starts combining all those elements, strategy, control, precision, resilience, the conversation shifts. It stops being about one race. And starts being about the future. Antonelli now sits at the top of the championship, building a lead that's starting to feel structural, not temporary. And that changes how every team approaches the next race. Because now, they're not just chasing performance. They're chasing understanding. How is Mercedes doing this with fewer upgrades? Where's the real advantage? And more importantly, is what we saw in Miami repeatable? Because if it is, then this wasn't just a controversial win under investigation. It was the moment a new kind of dominance began. And if it's not, then Miami becomes something else entirely. An outlier. A perfect storm. A race where everything aligned just once. But here's the uncomfortable part. Right now, nobody can prove either. Not the teams. Not the media. Not even the FIA. And that's exactly why the investigation matters. Not because it confirms guilt, but because it tries to answer a much deeper question. Was this victory built on the absolute edge of what's allowed? Or did Antonelli simply show that he understands that edge better than anyone else on the grid? Because if it's the second option, then the rest of the season just became a lot more dangerous for everyone chasing him.